Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Um, it's so sweet to be here. And one of the bumps in the road that prevented me from being with you all last year was I bumped my head and had a little concussion. So we have been trying to get me to San Diego for a while, and I'm really grateful that it's happening now. And so I do know that there are some folks from all over the world. So I'm so grateful to each of you for showing up. And a lot of gratitude to the Sangha, a lot of gratitude to to San Diego, and to Irene for inviting me and to bring me back. So for those of you who we have not met before, my name is Booker. My pronouns are she and her, and I live on the unceded territory of the Lenape people here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the reason why I honor land acknowledgement and that I name the original stewards of this land is that to remind us of what happens when we forget that we belong to each other, to remind us what happens when there is greed, hatred, and delusion, and all the destruction that can happen. So I want to bring in my ancestors into this space, beginning with my ancestors of liberation. So starting with the poet, writer, mother, warrior, activist Audre Lorde, who has inspired me to look at my self-care as a political act. I want to bring in Malcolm X, who famously said, by all means necessary. And for me, that's really has inspired me to find my own path in these Buddhist teachings. And then my teacher ancestors, which include Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, incredibly prolific writer, an activist who has invited us to see with Sangha eyes, to walk with Sangha feet, and to feel with a Sangha heart. And also Nani Bala Barua, who is affectionately known as Deepa Ma. And Deepa Ma broke barriers in Bangladesh as a householder who and mother who really committed to the path of enlightenment and encouraged other women to begin their spiritual um, training while in their duties of their everyday lives. And so these teachers taught us that these practices are not just for ourselves, but for the collective liberation of all beings. So these are just a few shoulders that I stand upon to be here with you all today. So the original title of this talk was Tending to the Emotional Body. But I wanted to go a step further and speak about the liberation that can be cultivated through having an intimate knowing of the body. So we're in the middle of April, which for me means allergy season. So there might be some sneezing and sniffling throughout my talk today. It's also the month where we turn our attention towards that first precept of protecting life, specifically the life of the earth on which we live in as we celebrate Earth Day, which is the beginning of next week. For many in the world, the earth and its resources are things that we take for granted, including the power of the sun, the energy of the wind and the water, the ground upon which we rest. And this weekend also marks two holidays for many folks, today being Passover and tomorrow is Easter. And so with all that is springing and coming alive in our natural world, there is still a sense of disorientation and disjointedness and an overall kind of ungroundedness happening within us and around us. Even before these last 2 years, there's been a sense of disconnection. And for some reason, many of us think that we're the only ones who are feeling it, as if it's our own personal failing that we can't find a sense of stillness or ground to hold us. But this disconnection isn't ours as individuals. It's the impact of living in an incredibly unstable political world an unstable climate, the delusion of separateness. We forget that we have an intimate and unmistakable, interdependent, interwoven, and interconnected web that holds us each to each other and our natural world. And one of the ways of that our practice reminds us that we belong to each other is by offering the 5 precepts. These practices that invite us in to explore how we can protect life, how we can be generous, how we can care for the sexuality of ourselves and others, making sure that we're using speech that is harmonious, and also caring for the intoxicants for a clear mind and heart. And there are 3 additional ones that typically are held by monastics that include not sleeping on a high and lofty bed, as that would take us away from the earth. So in our culture, success is typically measured by how far away we can get from the earth, away from the natural world. We call folks who are doing well upwardly mobile, and those who are not doing well as they've hit rock bottom. We see royal families sitting up on high thrones and waving from their balconies. And the years that I worked in the fashion industry, the higher the heels, the better. And when I was growing up, I loved the show The Jeffersons. And for a lot of us here in America, that might be a very familiar show, but I know a lot of our friends are here from Europe. And I just want to, so The Jeffersons was this amazing show in the 70s. That was the story of George Jefferson and his wife. And they were, he had a dry cleaning business and began to do very well. And so they moved uptown. And so the theme song says that they're moving on up to the east side to a deluxe apartment in the sky. And so even that, you know, when you make it, you move uptown, you live in a high rise, again, getting further and further and further away from the natural world. And so even the proximity away from the feminine and its natural qualities of receptivity, inclusivity, and empathy, which are inherently connected to the earth, are seen as better in our culture if we move away from them. So this is from one of my teachers, Zenju Earthlyn Manuel, who is from the Zen lineage, and she's more of a medicine woman at this stage in her life. The Zenju says, I come not to trust my own innate wisdom. By internalizing the judgments of those who felt that certain types of folks are lesser, I had betrayed myself. I had yielded to oppression. Oppression is a distortion of our true nature. It disconnects us from the earth and from each other. Awakening from the distortion of oppression begins with tenderness. We recognize our own wounded tenderness, which develops into the tenderness of vulnerability and culminates in the tenderness that comes with heartfelt and authentic liberation. And so this tenderness, this vulnerability that she's speaking to that can lead to authentic liberation can be known through citta, the 3rd foundation of mindfulness. And citta refers to this momentary combination of when our emotional life and our mental activity kind of come together, which make up this very brief moment in the expression of the mind. Okay, so it's a combination of our emotions and our mental activity that come together to create the expression of the mind in this very brief moment. So chitta gives us the opportunity to move towards, to explore, to investigate, to get curious about our emotional lives. It's not a pushing away, but rather a pulling towards, gathering information so we're not living in our own delusion. And one of the ways that we can explore this is by knowing how the elements are alive in our body. So, for example, we might be mindful of the emotion of anger rising in our body. So we might notice that the fire element, the heat, is arising in the body. Or we might feel the air element, the wind element, if we feel tightness or constriction. And then we might notice that the mental quality in our stillness that was actually underneath this fire, this heat, and also this tightness and contraction is the feeling of anger. This mental quality of shrunkenness, of not being seen, heard, or our experiences being validated. So this perspective, this clarity, can immediately shift our relationship to the emotion. And so if we can feel into it, recognize it, and know that it's just a momentary expression, then it can completely transform how we relate to it. When we know that things are impermanent and that they don't last forever. So a few days ago, I took my weekly Thursday night Yin Yoga class. And for those of you who don't know what Yin Yoga is, it's this really beautiful practice which looks like you're not doing too much from the outside world. But it quiets everything down and allows me to know and to feel everything. And so in our yin practice, we kind of take a classic yoga posture and we hold it for 1, 3, or 7 minutes. So it really gives us this opportunity to feel what's happening. And then the layer underneath that. And then the layer underneath that. So we don't move away when there's discomfort. We actually stay and we see what else needs to be known underneath. And the instruction that the teacher often gives is to bring the earth closer to us. And so we do this by using different props in the yoga class, or by using the breath to feel the earth come closer and to touch this body. She invites us to see how we can fall deeper into the earth and what else is there, what else needs to be known. And so I was lying in class the other day and I began to really feel the elements come alive in my body. And I think I was so attuned to it because we've had these really heavy rains in Philadelphia this last month actually. And there was a huge rainstorm happening outside. And so I was lying in my practice and I began to think about how I knew my body, how I was experiencing my emotions, this experience through the elements. And I know that with water element, this element that is connected to our emotional life, water is connected to the second chakra in the yoga world, which is connected to our emotions and the water element. And so we understand that when we're in our emotional lives, that with that connection of water, that things are constantly flowing and moving and shifting, that we're not stuck, we're not frozen, because even ice melts, right? So there's this beautiful flow. And I also notice that this is where my creativity flows. On days where it's raining outside, that's where I am my most creative, when I do most of my writing. And my girlfriend wakes up and she's like, ah, it's raining. And she gets like really annoyed about it. I'm like, yes, I can actually get some creative work done today. And so that's how I know how I experience water element in my body. And then I thought about fire element. And to be awake, to be alive, to be paying attention to what's happening around us brings us in direct relationship with strong emotions like rage and anger and fear, sadness. So to feel anger is an appropriate response to all of the atrocities that are happening in the world around us. Between the global pandemic, food instability, the impact of multiple climate catastrophes, xenophobia, homophobia, paternalism, good old-fashioned racism, there's a lot for us to feel anger about in our lives. From Thanissara's book, Time to Stand Up. And Thanissara is, of course, a really wonderful teacher in the Insight lineage, along with her husband, Kittisaro. They teach together often. So in Thanissara's book, Time to Stand Up, she says, anger untransformed burns us up. It injures others. Or more commonly, because we repress it, we push it away, it saps our life force and collapses us into depression. And so I really look as fire element when I feel that heat arising in my body as a catalyst for change. It allows me to recognize it's not something to push away, but to turn towards and to transform my anger, that rage, into action. Wind element for me is my cue to stop moving my arms so much, as Pablo Neruda says in his poem, Keeping Quiet. In Ayurveda, which is an ancient Indian science, my dosha, or like my body type, is Vata, which is connected to wind and air. So when my dosha is aggravated, when I'm out of balance, I'm very cold, I'm brittle, I'm dry, I'm very delicate. I'm very delicate. And this typically happens in, for all of this, like the think about the way that your hair or your skin changes in winter. That's Vata season. And so I know that when I'm feeling this wind element, feeling kind of brittle, when I feel that in my body, I know that it's time for me to pause, to rest, to nourish myself, to hydrate myself, to hibernate a little bit. And then there is the earth element. And earth element is hopefully where I teach from. When earth element is known and experienced and alive in my body, I feel rested and grounded and resourced. When I'm aligned with my values, when I say no to something because it's not aligned with the ethos that I've set forth for myself, that's when I know that I'm really connected to earth element in my body. And so as we can locate ourselves within our natural world, we can see that the natural cycle of our lifespan, of all living beings, is an exact map of our practice, the cycle of our practice, and the cycle of our emotional lives. And so in nature, things are born, they live, they die, they go back to the earth, they nourish the earth, and then life begins again. In our emotional lives, things arise, like our fear, our anger, our rage, our sadness, right? They abide, they hang out for a while, and then they pass away. we go back to our anchor and we take that next breath. And so there is a patience and also an intimacy that is needed when we are tending to our emotional lives. So we're getting to know these waves of irritation, of anger, of rage, of anxiety, of fear, of love, of compassion, of patience and impatience, of guilt and shame, healthy and unhealthy pride, healthy and unhealthy desire, ambition, striving. We can keep adding on to that list, right? So when we're in that patience, we can see how all of these things arise and they pass away, or they kind of ride in a wave, right? So they're not always the most prominent thing in our lives. And so I'm going to pause there and give us some time to allow these words, these thoughts, these concepts to sink into our body and to be known.